Hi, my name is Dhyani, and in this video we'll talk about workflows, approval type and approval limit type in Business Central. This is second video in this series, and there will be others that I'll be adding later. If you remember, in the first video we talked about workflow categories, workflow templates, and how you create a new workflow from the template. In this video we'll talk about two things. One of them is approval type, and the other one is approval limit type. And let's see what that means. If you are coming from a Dynamics Nav background, how it relates it to your old approval, and then how you can translate that into the workflows. So as I said earlier, that I'll be using Business Central 16 2020 release wave 1, but you can follow these steps in Dynamics Nav 2016 and higher. Workflow haven't changed much with the change in the product. So let's start, and let's log into our Business Central tenant. So we'll start from where we left, which is we'll open our workflow page. And as we set this workflow from the template in the last video, we'll now understand what is approval types and what are approval limit types. So if you remember, on the first video we talked about that when the first event occurs, there are multiple responses that actually execute, and one of them is create an approval request for the record using approval type salesperson and approval limit type as approval chain. So let's see what we can change based on your specific business needs in that particular response. So click on the response section of the first workflow event. It'll open a separate page. You can maximize it if you want. I already had that maximized. The first one is add record restrictions. We already talked about it yesterday. Another one is set document status to pending approval. That's the same which we talked about in the past video. And then the next one that we want to pay focus or attention is create an approval request for the record using approval type and approval limit. So let's start from beginning, what different fields are and how we can use them. The first one here is due date formula, and that's a date formula that you can key in, and based on this date formula that you key in, let's say 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, based on how the business needs it, it tells system that after how many days the approval request that is sent by an user either should be approved or rejected after the date it was sent. So let's say it was sent on 1st July 2020 and you have a date formula of 1D. So that means that it should get approved or rejected by approver in 1 day after that request has been sent. The next one is delegate after, which means when you want to delegate a approval request. As we talked about it yesterday, delegate means it shift that approval entry to the substitute user. If you want to delegate it based on a specific number of days, you can choose that. 1, 2 and 5 are the options available, and then by default it's never. So you can change after how many days you want to trigger automatic delegation of that particular entry to the substitute approver. Now Coming to the last 2 points which we will be discussing, there are 3 options in approver type. One is salesperson purchaser, we'll talk about it. The other one is approver, and the last one is workflow user group. You might relate salesperson purchaser from your dynamics nav, and we'll come back to it. But let's talk about the new one which is added, which is workflow user group. So when you choose workflow user group, the other option of approval limit is removed and it is replaced with workflow user group code, which is a new functionality in the workflow. Now what that means is you can actually define a workflow user group code where there are multiple users that are already defined, and let's set it up for first, and then maybe it'll make sense. So you can always search for workflow user group. By default it will be empty. Let's click new and create a new one, and I'll call it as demo 1. This workflow user group is for demo purpose. It's for demo. Now workflow user group is a new user or a approval option added in Business Central, and the way it works is that you can define the users that will be approving. So let's see, I don't see any approver user, so I'll have to first set up my approval user setup. So let's set that up, and we'll talk about it later also, so no worries. Let's say my name, and then I also set up approver 1 and approver 2, and we'll come back to it later again to understand it. Coming back to workflow user group members, I can choose any approver, any numbers of approver 1 and approver 2, just to give you a demo. If you see, there are 2 fields. One is username, which means which user will be the approver, and then there is a sequence number. Now what is sequence number? Sequence number specifies the order in which the workflow users engage in a workflow relative to other users. For example, to specify when the user approves relative to other approvers, when you use the workflow user group option in the approver type on the related workflow response. Now what that means is, if you use workflow user group in your approval setup window and you have a setup like this for the workflow user group, based on the sequence right now, if a sales order approval is requested, first it will go to approver 1. Once he or she approves it, then it will go to approver 2, which is based on the sequence number. And you can always alter it, like I can say it 2 and I can change it to 1. I only find this workflow user group option logical in cases of when you have to approve a check where there are multiple people that can approve a check, but if either of them approves it, it is considered as approved. In that case, you can actually define both the sequence as same. When you define the sequence number as same, then either of these approvers, if they approve the document, then that document will be considered as approved. You don't actually have to get 2 approvals. You can get it approved by approving by any of these 2 users. Hope that makes sense. And you can create multiple workflow user groups based on your requirement, and then you can use them into your approval as workflow user group. So if you choose the workflow user group, then you can define which users can approve it and what is the sequence, and if they have the same sequence, then they all either of them approves it, the document will be considered as approved. So that's the first option. And before we go into other two options, let's go back and spend some time into our approval user setup window, which we have seen a while ago very quickly, but let's see it in detail. So in the approval user setup window, you can define your approval metrics. Who is the user? If that user sends it, which user will approve it? Is there an amount limit? What is his email ID? Who is the substitute? You can define all those parameters here. So let's go through all those fields one by one. User ID is the first field that we see here, and user ID is used to understand the username or to identify the user in the approval process. So user ID, in this case, let's say Saurav is the user who will be sending an approval request. Then that becomes my entry point, Saurav, and then I can define my metrics for the approval based on my entry point. The second field is Salesperson Purchaser code. If you in your business use salesperson or purchaser for maybe for commission or maybe responsible for that customer or vendor, and you want to include salesperson purchaser in the approval metrics, then you can choose the salesperson purchaser code for that particular user. When Saurav will request an approval entry for an order and it has a specific salesperson purchaser code defined, then and only then the approval will get invoked. So based on you may in your business relate one user with one salesperson, and whenever that invocation happen, you want to define a salesperson feasibility, then you can define that salesperson code here. For this demo, I'm not using it. The next field is approver ID. Here you need to select that who will approve the request made by this user. So let's choose, and I'll choose approver 1. That if Saurav sends an approval request, approver 1 is supposed to approve it. That's my first approver. Now the next one is sales amount approval limit. You can always tie a amount limit in local currency that this user will automatically approve. So just to pick a number, I'll say 100. So if in the entry that I'm sending for approval is less than 100, then it will get automatically approved, because Saurav has a limit that he can approve till $100 in local currency. Same, if you are using purchase and you have the same user, you can define the purchase one, which we will not be talking about in this video. Then we come down to request amount approval limit. Here you specify the maximum amount in local currency again that the user in user ID can approve for purchase quotes, only for purchase quotes. And the same applies. So this field of the amount limit applies for the sales amount, which is for sales documents. This one is for purchase amounts, and this one is for sales quote. We haven't talked about these three booleans, we'll talk about it. Then the substitute. Saurav is the entry point in this case, who will be creating or sending requests for approval. So we don't need a substitute for him, but we'll talk about it as we go forward. And then the email. Email is, let's say, my email, and this email is used for notification. And then the phone number, if you want to specify that, that's just an additional detail. And then the last is approval administrator, and we'll come down to it at the end. So now if Saurav creates a sales order and send it for approval, and if it is less than $100, it gets automatically approved. But if it is more than 100, then it goes to approver 1. So then approver 1 can approve, just to pick a number, till $1,000. And I'll keep the email ID as same. So if the amount of the order that is sent is till 100, it will get auto approved. It is more than 100, then it goes to approver 1, because that's what is defined here. But what if it is more than 1000? Then I'm saying that if it goes beyond the limit of that approver, then my second approver becomes approver 2. Now I want to make sure that anything more than $1,000 is approved by approver 2. It's the end approver or the last approver. In that case, I don't define the approver ID, but I don't define the approval limit. What I do is I define that this user is unlimited sales approver. That means any amount that is more than $1,000 that comes to this user, approver 2, he'll be able to approve it. So it becomes my unlimited approver. In the same way, there is a unlimited purchase approver and unlimited request approval. Hope that makes sense. There's no confusion. But just to test out the substitute functionality, you can also define who's the substitute, and I don't have much here, so I'll add one more test user. And I say that if my approver 2 is not available for certain reasons, then the test user can approve it if it gets delegated. Now the last but not least, I'll create one more user, which is admin, and then I check the boolean of approval administrator. Now what is approval administrator boolean does? You need to set that boolean for the user who have rights to unblock approval workflows. For example, like delegating approval request to the substitute, and also delegating overdue approval entries based on the first field that we saw in our workflow, which was due date formula. So that overdue approval entries can also be delegated by this user. Once you are done, once you have set this up, you can always use approval user setup test to test your approval. And then you need to check which user you want to check it, what you are testing, sales or purchase or request, and then do a preview and show you how your approval is correct or not based on certain calculation that system has. So as you can see, and if you cannot, let me zoom in, okay, and go up if I can. Okay, this is my test setup for sales approval limit. If user ID Saurav sends a document, it goes to approver 1 only and only if it's more than $100, and it says that it's okay, status is okay. If it is more than $100, it goes to approver 1, and it only goes to approver 2 if it is more than $1,000 and status is okay, and then approver 2 is my unlimited approver. And if you see, this is the sequence that will be followed when I use this setting in my workflow. So let's, as we have set up our approval user setup, let's go back to our workflow and let's talk about it. So the first one is Salesperson and Purchaser, which we already talked about, that if you are using Salesperson and Purchaser in your approval setup, then choose this option of Salesperson and Purchaser. It's actually not different from the other one, which is approver, and I'll tell you why. If you click on Salesperson Purchaser, you get these four options into approval limit type, and we'll talk about it after this. Approval chain, direct approver, first qualified, and specific. And then approver, if I choose that, I get the same option. So the only difference is that are you using Salesperson Purchaser or not. So hope approval type is clear. Now let's talk about approval limit type. Approval limit type have four options: approver chain, direct approver, first qualified approver, and specific approver. Let's start from easy one. If you define or choose the specific approver, that means you want to send your request to a specific user ID. No matrix, no flow, just one particular user. So I can choose in that case which user it should go, and let's say I say admin. So anytime a sales order approval request is requested by the user, it will always go to one specific user, which is admin. Let's come up in our approval limit type and choose first qualified approver. Now how does first qualified approver works? The first qualified approver only creates the request for the first qualified approver in the matrix. So let me open the matrix again and we'll understand what that means. That if my order is, let's say, less than $100, then there is no entry required because it's automatically get approved by Saurabh. But if it is greater than 100 and less than 1000, then it will only create one entry for approver 1, right? Because this one will get automatically approved. There will be two entries, but this one will get auto approved because the entry is created by the same person who is sending for the approval. And then there will be an entry open for approver 1, which is okay. Now if the sales order which is coming is more than $1,000, in that case, and we'll talk about it, what first qualified approver will do, that the first qualified person to approve $2,000 is approver 2. So it will create one entry for approver 2, which will be open. It will skip approver 1 in that case, because the first person who can approve that amount is approver 2. So it doesn't go or follow the matrix, it skips to the person or to the approver who can approve that amount. Hope that's clear. Let's go to the next option, which is direct approver. Now in this option, only the direct approval will receive the approval request regardless of approval limit type. What that means, that if in this case, if the entry is created or the order is for $100 or $99, let's say, then this entry will be open and the person need to go to and approve that entry. So the approval request will go directly to the immediate approver of the requester, regardless of limit or order amount. So if I see direct approver and if Saurav is creating it, then it will always go to approver 1. Either the amount is less than 100, more than 100, more than 1000. It will always go to the direct approver of the person who is requesting it. So if I create, as Saurav, create a sales order which have an amount, irrespective of amount, it will always go to approver 1. Hope that makes sense. In any amount, it will always go to approver 1 if Saurav creates an order. The first one is approver chain, and that's what is kind of interesting or follows most of the business processes that we see. What happens in approver chain is it follows the same chain. If it is less than 100, automatically approved. Greater than 100 and less than 1000 goes to approver 1. This one creates an approval entry for this. If it is more than 1000, then 2 entries are created, one for approver 1, one for approver 2, and they all need to approve it before the document status changes to open. Anytime an approval entry is created, the first entry is created for the same person who is sending it, and it automatically gets approved because the sender name and the approver name is same. So in all these scenarios which we discussed, other than direct approver, an entry will be created and approved for Saurav. So you can choose these two options based on your business requirement: approver type and approver limit type, and set up your approval user setup or your workflow user group based on how your business needs it. So I hope you find the second video useful and you understand what are approval types and what are approval limit types in workflows. Please share your views and suggestion as comment to this video. If you want a demo of how approval type and approval limit type works, let me know in comment section and I'll make sure that I create a demo and we go through all these different options in separate videos if required. Please do share the video and subscribe to this channel. Have a great day and see you next time.